The Mafia boss's daughter hadn't eaten for 2 weeks, until the Black Maid did the impossible. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. Alexander Crowe had built his life on control, the kind measured in square footage, quarterly numbers, and the silent obedience of rooms that listened before he spoke. Yet for 14 straight days, none of that mattered because his 8-year-old daughter, Emily Crowe, had refused to eat a single full meal, not breakfast at the Long Marble Island, not lunch prepared by chefs flown in from 3 states away, not dinner served on porcelain that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and the doctors said her vitals were stable but drifting. The therapist said grief can lock a child's body like a door with no handle, and Alexander stood in the doorway every morning counting the steps from her bed to the window, as if distance itself were the problem, watching Emily stare past the glass toward a backyard that stretched a quarter-acre, yet felt smaller than a hospital room, her frame thin beneath a hoodie 2 sizes too big, her hands folded as if holding onto something only she could feel, while the house moved around them like a museum after hours, quiet, careful, afraid to make the wrong sound. Alexander could buy solutions by the hour, and he did, scheduling consults in 30-minute blocks, approving invoices with a nod, timing progress in days and weeks like a business turnaround. But Emily's silence didn't respond to calendars, and when she pushed a plate away with a soft shake of her head, he felt the ground give a little more, the kind of loss that doesn't crash but erodes. Downstairs, Ruth Johnson arrived early and left late, a new maid whose name had barely been learned by the staff, moving through hallways with a steady calm, wiping fingerprints from glass and folding towels to hotel corners, noticing the rhythms others missed, the way the house inhaled before dusk and exhaled after midnight, the way Alexander lingered outside a door longer than he meant to, the way Emily's room stayed untouched by trays that came back full, and no one asked Ruth to help because no one thought to, because in houses like this help was specialized and labeled and priced, and she was none of those things, just another uniform passing through. Alexander watched Emily one afternoon measure out 2 tablespoons of soup with her spoon and then stop, her eyes unfocused, the spoon hovering until it lowered again untouched, and he turned away because fathers learn where not to look when they don't want to break, stepping into a study that smelled like leather and coffee and old decisions, telling himself he would try again tomorrow. That persistence always wins if you invest enough. Yet somewhere between the ticking clock and the hum of the air system, he understood this was different. That power could not persuade a body to feel safe. And upstairs, Ruth paused outside Emily's room with a folded blanket in her hands, feeling a familiar ache she never named, listening to a house that had forgotten how to feed its own child, and the impossible waited quietly, patient as breath, for someone willing to sit where permission had never been given. The next morning unfolded with the precision of a schedule that no longer worked, trays moving up and down the stairs at fixed times, stainless steel lids lifted and closed with quiet efficiency, and every plate returning the way it left, full and untouched, as if the food itself had learned not to hope. Alexander Crowe watched from a distance he pretended was respectful, standing just outside Emily's room, while a nutrition specialist spoke in calm phrases about calories and hydration, about patience and trust, words that sounded reasonable until they floated away without landing anywhere useful. Emily sat cross-legged on her bed, her back straight, her gaze lowered to a paperback she had not turned a page of in 10 minutes, answering questions with nods so small they barely registered, her body present but guarded, like a house locked from the inside. When the specialist left, Alexander nodded once and said thank you, the same way he always did, then stood alone in the hallway longer than necessary, listening to the soft hum of the air vents, and wondering when he had last heard his daughter laugh out loud. Downstairs, the staff adjusted quietly, stepping softer, speaking less, avoiding the 3rd floor unless summoned. And in that careful choreography, Ruth Johnson remained unnoticed, moving from room to room with a cart that squeaked only when it thought no one was listening. She learned the house by feel rather than map, The way the light changed after noon in the east wing, the place where the wood floor dipped near the back stairs, the rhythm of a place built to impress, but not to comfort. She noticed the pattern of untouched meals without being told, the way silverware returned clean, the way napkins came back folded exactly as they had gone up, and she noticed something else too, something harder to name, the tension that settled around a child when adults tried too hard. At lunch, a chef carefully arranged a grilled cheese cut into neat triangles, measuring the portion like a formula, and when Emily pushed the plate away again, the room seemed to hold its breath until Alexander exhaled and waved it off, his voice steady, his eyes not quite meeting his daughter's. Later, as the afternoon stretched thin, Ruth folded laundry in a quiet corner near the stairs that led up, pairing socks by habit, smoothing wrinkles with the flat of her palm, remembering a time when small clothes meant small worries, when a child's appetite had once been the measure of a good day. No one asked her opinion, and she did not offer it, because in houses like this opinions traveled downward only when invited, and she was not invited anywhere. In the late afternoon, Emily's tutor arrived and left without opening a book, offering reassurance that sounded practiced, and Alexander nodded again, thanking him with the same controlled politeness, the kind that hid a rising fear. Dinner came early and left early, the tray barely disturbed, and when the door closed behind the staff, Alexander sat at the edge of his desk, hands clasped, staring at nothing in particular, calculating outcomes that refused to calculate back. Upstairs, Emily lay on her side facing the wall, the light from the window tracing the outline of her small frame, and in the hallway Ruth paused with a folded blanket she had not been asked to bring, listening to the quiet that pressed against the door. She did not knock, did not step forward, did not break a rule she had not been given permission to break, but something in her chest tightened all the same, because she recognized this silence, this kind of waiting that stretched past hunger and into something deeper, and as the house settled into evening, one truth became unavoidable to those who lived there, spoken by no one and felt by everyone, that everything being done was correct, professional, approved, and still, somehow, it was all missing the one thing Emily seemed to need. By the third day of this routine, the house had learned a new rule that no one announced but everyone obeyed. Do not expect progress, because expectation only sharpened disappointment, and Alexander Crow felt it most acutely during breakfast when Emily did not even sit at the table anymore, choosing instead the window seat where she could watch a bird land and leave without touching the plate set beside her. He did not scold, did not plead, did not raise his voice, because authority had taught him that pressure created resistance. Yet each untouched meal felt like a quiet failure being documented in real time. The staff adjusted again, rotating menus, changing textures, warming milk to precise temperatures measured in degrees, timing presentations to the minute, and when nothing changed, frustration began to show in small ways, a sigh held too long, a glance exchanged behind a door, a whispered comment about how nothing seemed to work. Ruth Johnson heard those whispers as she wiped down counters and polished handles that already shined, and she kept her head down, because invisibility was part of the job, and she had learned long ago how to wear it well. When a senior housekeeper noticed her lingering near the stairwell, she was reminded gently, but firmly that the third floor was restricted unless assigned, and Ruth nodded once, apologizing even though she had done nothing wrong, retreating with the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to being corrected for simply noticing. That afternoon, a well-known child psychologist arrived and left an hour later with the same calm recommendations Alexander had heard before, on air, and someone else replied that it was not their problem if the kid refused to eat. Words that landed heavier than intended in a house already weighted with fear. Ruth stood at the sink rinsing dishes that had barely been used, watching food swirl away down the drain, thinking of how hunger could be louder than anger and harder to fix than either. When dinner failed again, Alexander dismissed the staff early, choosing silence over advice, and sat alone at the long table long after the plates were cleared, his shoulders slightly rounded in a posture no one would have recognized from boardrooms or meetings. Upstairs, Emily sat on the floor of her room with her back against the bed, drawing lines on a notepad that did not become pictures, her face calm in a way that unsettled the adults watching through cracked doors. She was not defiant, not dramatic, not angry. She was simply unreachable, and that frightened Alexander more than any tantrum could have. Late in the evening, Ruth carried a stack of folded blankets toward the linen closet near the back stairs, moving carefully to avoid making noise. And as she passed the third-floor landing, she heard a sound that made her stop. Not a cry, not a word, just a slow, uneven breath that reminded her of nights spent counting the rise and fall of a small chest years ago. She did not step forward, did not cross the invisible line drawn by wealth and hierarchy, but the sound stayed with her as she finished her work, following her into the quiet of the staff corridor, where she stood for a moment longer than required, hands resting on the cart, feeling the familiar sting of being close to something important and knowing that no one would ever ask her to be part of it. In a house full of experts and authority, Ruth Johnson remained unseen, and Emily Crow remained unfed, and the distance between those two truths grew heavier with each passing hour. That night, after the lights dimmed and the house finally surrendered to a fragile quiet, Ruth Johnson stayed awake in the small room assigned to staff, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed with her shoes still on, listening to the building settle as if it were breathing around her. A child upstairs counted time in hunger and adults counted it in minutes. And when she closed her eyes, she saw not marble hallways or polished counters, but a modest kitchen from years ago, warm with steam and the soft clatter of a spoon against a bowl. She remembered measuring rice by feel instead of cups, letting it cook until it broke apart the way a child liked it. Remembered how patience tasted when it was shared. Her son had been small for his age, a quiet boy who spoke carefully and ate slowly, who trusted warmth before flavor, and she had learned then that feeding a child was never about the food alone. Prepared him for helplessness, and when he finally sat, he covered his face with his hands and stayed that way longer than he would admit. Picked up the spoon and took a small bite herself, not hurried, not cautious, simply present, the steam warming her face as much as the taste warmed her mouth. She did not speak. She did not look at Emily. She ate another spoonful and set the bowl down again, resting her hands on her knees as if she had nowhere else to be. The house seemed to lean in, listening, and somewhere downstairs a floorboard creaked as Alexander shifted his weight in his study, unaware that something quiet was unfolding above him. Emily's eyes moved first, not to Ruth's face but to the bowl, tracking it with a curiosity that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with safety. Ruth stayed still. She took another spoonful, slower this time, then set the spoon down and waited, letting the simple rhythm speak for itself. Minutes passed, measured not by clocks but by the soft ticking of Emily's breathing as it evened slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing by degrees too small to notice unless you were looking for them. Ruth reached for the spoon again, dipped it, and paused, holding it midair before placing it back in the bowl untouched, as if to say there was no rush, no test, no requirement. Emily shifted, turning just enough that her profile caught the low light, her gaze lingering on the steam rising and fading. Finally, her voice broke the silence, not loud, not demanding, just a question placed carefully into the room, asking whether the food was warm. Ruth answered without turning, her tone steady and soft, saying that it was warm and made slowly, the way it should be. Emily slid off the window seat and onto the floor, stopping several feet away, close enough to see but far enough to retreat, and Ruth responded by moving the bowl a few inches closer without pushing it into her space. She returned to stillness, hands open, posture relaxed, as if nothing depended on the next moment even though everything did. Emily sat down, her movements cautious, her eyes flicking once toward the doorway and then back to the bowl, and Ruth waited again, refusing to fill the space with encouragement. When Emily reached for the spoon, her hand trembled just slightly, and Ruth did not move, did not comment, did not breathe louder. The spoon hovered, then dipped, then rose to Emily's lips, and she took the smallest taste possible, barely enough to register, but enough to change the air in the room. Ruth kept her gaze forward, letting the silence hold, trusting that the first step belonged to the child and no one else. The room did not celebrate the moment because it did not know how. It simply adjusted, the way spaces do when something fragile has shifted, and Emily held the spoon for a long second after that first taste, as if waiting for permission that never came. Ruth remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her attention soft and indirect, trusting the pause as much as the action, because she knew that rushing the second step could undo the first. Emily lowered the spoon back into the bowl and breathed out slowly, the sound small but real, then dipped the spoon again and took another taste, slightly larger than the first, her eyes closing for a brief instant as warmth registered somewhere deeper than hunger. Ruth nodded once, not at Emily but to herself, acknowledging the rhythm without marking it, and she shifted her weight only enough to stay comfortable, careful not to signal that anything was being watched. Outside the room, Alexander Crow stood frozen mid-step, having come upstairs with no intention beyond checking the hall and finding himself anchored by the quiet scene before him, his hand resting against the doorframe, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He did not enter. He did not clear his throat. He did not call his daughter's name. He watched with a stillness he had learned in places where speaking too soon changed outcomes, recognizing that whatever power he carried had no place here. Emily took a third spoonful, then set the spoon down deliberately, her movements precise and thoughtful, and she looked at Ruth for the first time, really looked, her gaze steady and curious rather than fearful. She asked a simple question about how long it had taken to make the food, her voice quiet but clear, and Ruth answered honestly, saying that it took as long as it needed, no more and no less. Emily considered that, then reached for the spoon again, her hand steadier now, and ate another bite, then another, not fast, not slow, but with intention, as if each movement were a choice she was making for herself. The air in the room changed in a way that did not announce itself, tension loosening by small degrees, the kind of relief that does not rush in but settles carefully so as not to frighten what it has come to protect. Alexander felt it and did nothing with the feeling except let it exist, his eyes damp without tears, his breath shallow and controlled, his mind finally quiet. Ruth shifted her gaze to the window, giving Emily privacy even as she stayed present, and she spoke again only when Emily asked if the food could stay warm for later, assuring her that it could, that it would wait. Emily nodded, satisfied, and took 2 more bites before pushing the bowl a few inches away, not in refusal but in pause, her body signaling that it had reached a boundary it could honor without fear. Ruth accepted that boundary without comment, sliding the bowl closer to herself, but leaving it visible, an open invitation rather than a demand. Alexander stepped back from the doorway then, retreating without sound, understanding instinctively that the most important thing he could do was not be seen, not yet. In that quiet exchange, nothing dramatic happened, and everything changed, because a child had eaten by choice, a woman had offered care without condition, and a man who commanded rooms had learned that sometimes the bravest act was to stand still and let gentleness do what force never could. The night did not end with celebration or relief. It ended with quiet vigilance, the kind that keeps watch without disturbing what it protects. And Alexander Crow remained awake long after the lights in the house dimmed, sitting in a chair outside Emily's room with his jacket folded over his arm, listening to the steady rhythm of his daughter's breathing as if it were something newly learned. He did not enter, did not speak, did not send messages or summon anyone, because the small progress he had witnessed felt too delicate to touch with authority, and for the first time in weeks he allowed himself to believe that restraint was not surrender. Inside the room, Ruth stayed seated on the floor until Emily shifted again, signaling that the moment had reached its natural close, and when the child lay back on her bed with a softness that had been missing for days, Ruth rose. Quietly, lifting the bowl and spoon with care, pausing once at the doorway to look back not at the girl, but at the space itself, committing the stillness to memory. She carried the bowl downstairs without haste, washed it, dried it, and returned it to its place as if nothing unusual had occurred, because in her experience the most meaningful acts were often those that left no trace. Morning arrived gently, filtered through curtains that softened the light, and when breakfast time came, no one rushed upstairs with trays or instructions, no one announced plans or goals, because Alexander had made a decision during the early hours to let the day unfold without pressure. He informed the staff in simple terms that the schedule was flexible and that no one was to enter Emily's room unless invited, his tone calm and absolute, leaving no room for interpretation. Ruth resumed her work with the same quiet efficiency as before, but something had shifted in the way the house regarded her, a subtle awareness that followed her movements. Not respect yet, but attention. Mid-morning, Emily appeared at the top of the stairs for the first time in days, her steps slow but steady, her eyes scanning the open space below with caution rather than fear, and Alexander froze where he stood, afraid to move and afraid not to, settling instead for stillness. Ruth was folding towels at the far end of the room when Emily descended the last step and stopped, looking around as if confirming that nothing would be demanded of her, and when she spotted Ruth, her expression softened in a way that made Alexander's throat tighten. Emily crossed the room and sat on the floor a few feet away, mirroring the posture from the night before, and without speaking, Ruth finished folding the towel and set it aside, lowering herself to sit again, matching the distance, matching the calm. They did not talk about food. They did not talk about feelings. They existed in the same space, breathing at the same pace, and after a while Emily asked if the warm bowl could come back later. Not now, just later, and Ruth nodded, saying that it could wait as long as needed. Alexander watched from across the room, his hands clasped tightly, understanding that something essential was being rebuilt in increments too small to measure, but too important to interrupt. Later that afternoon, Emily took a few more bites when the bowl returned, not because she was asked but because she chose to, and Alexander did what he had never done in his professional life. He did nothing at all. No praise, no reward, no visible reaction, honoring the fragile autonomy taking root. In that restraint, he learned something fundamental, that strength was not always expressed through action, and that the woman everyone had overlooked had given his daughter back a sense of choice that money and influence could not buy. By the following day, the house began to move differently, not louder or faster, but with a new care that could not be written into schedules, and Alexander Crow noticed it in the way doors were left slightly open, in the way voices softened without being instructed to do so. Emily's routine shifted in small, meaningful ways, a few spoonfuls here, a pause there, a request to stop without fear that stopping meant failure, and Alexander learned to mark progress not by quantity, but by willingness, not by charts, but by the light returning to his daughter's eyes. He canceled appointments without explanation, letting professionals wait while something more important unfolded, and when asked why, he said only that they were managing, a word that finally felt honest. Ruth Johnson continued her work as she always had, folding, wiping, arranging, her presence steady and unassuming. Yet now Emily sought her out with quiet intention, choosing to sit nearby while Ruth worked, asking simple questions about the order of tasks, about why towels were folded a certain way, about how long it took for water to boil. Ruth answered without embellishment, never turning these moments into lessons, letting curiosity lead where pressure never could. In the afternoons, Emily ate a little more, sometimes alone, sometimes with Ruth seated on the floor nearby, never counting bites, never being told she should finish, and that freedom did more than encouragement ever had. Alexander watched from a respectful distance, learning to read the room instead of commanding it, discovering that leadership had a quieter form he had never needed before. One evening, after Emily had eaten enough to ask for her favorite book and stayed awake long enough to read a few pages aloud, Alexander asked Ruth to join him briefly in the study, his request delivered with a calm that surprised even him. He did not stand behind the desk when she entered, did not tower, did not question. He simply thanked her, the words measured and sincere, acknowledging that something essential had changed because she had chosen to act without being asked. Ruth listened, nodding once, accepting the gratitude without letting it define her, because she knew that care did not require recognition to remain valid. The days that followed settled into a rhythm built on trust rather than control, Emily gaining strength not because she was pushed, but because she felt safe enough to choose nourishment, and Alexander adapting in ways that reshaped more than his household. He adjusted expectations, gave space where he once filled it, and in doing so found a steadiness that had been missing long before his daughter stopped eating. The staff observed the change and followed it, not because they were told to, but because calm was contagious when it was real. Ruth remained what she had always been on paper, a maid assigned to tasks. But in practice, she became something else entirely, a constant presence that asked for nothing and offered everything essential. Emily began to smile again, not often and not broadly, but enough, a sign that life was returning on her own terms. In the quiet hours, Alexander reflected on how close he had come to forcing solutions that would have closed the very door he needed open, and he understood then that what had saved his daughter was not authority or wealth, but patience, humility, and the courage to let someone he had overlooked do what he could not. In that understanding, the house found its balance again, not as a place ruled by power, but as a place guided by care. The weeks that followed did not announce themselves as a recovery. They revealed it quietly, in ordinary moments that would have gone unnoticed before, and Alexander Crow learned to recognize those moments as victories not to be claimed but to be protected. Emily began to eat consistently, not full plates and not on anyone else's timeline, but enough to sustain herself, enough to feel present again in her own body, and each choice she made strengthened something deeper than appetite. She asked for meals when she was ready, sometimes requesting the same simple food, sometimes choosing something new, and Alexander honored every request without comment, understanding now. That trust was built by listening rather than directing. Ruth Johnson remained a steady presence in the background of these days, her role unchanged on paper, but transformed in reality, because Emily sought her out with a comfort that could not be assigned or replaced, sitting nearby during meals or asking her to stay while she finished, not for supervision but for reassurance. Alexander watched this bond with a humility that reshaped him, recognizing that what had saved his daughter was not intervention but respect, the kind that allowed a child to reclaim agency without being reminded of loss. The house adjusted fully to this new rhythm, staff moving with intention rather than tension, conversations returning to normal volume, laughter finding its way back into shared spaces, and for the first time in a long while, the walls seemed to hold warmth instead of pressure. One afternoon, Alexander joined Emily and Ruth on the floor near the window where it had all begun, not sitting above them or directing the moment, but lowering himself to their level, listening as Emily explained which days felt harder and which felt easier, her words simple but honest. He did not interrupt. He did not fix. He learned. In that learning, he understood something fundamental about power, that it was most meaningful when it stepped aside for dignity. As days turned into weeks, Emily regained strength, her laughter returning in soft bursts, her curiosity widening again to include the world beyond her room, and Alexander felt a gratitude that could not be expressed with money or influence. He offered Ruth stability without conditions, ensuring her place in the household with the respect she had earned through care rather than demand, and Ruth accepted with the same quiet grace she had always carried, knowing that the true reward had already been given. On a calm evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the room in amber light, Emily finished her meal and set her spoon down, smiling without effort, and Alexander felt the room settle into a peace that did not need to be named. He looked at Ruth then, not as staff, not as someone overlooked, but as the person who had shown him the limits of control and the power of presence, and he nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that needed no words. The room went silent in that moment, not from tension but from understanding, and Alexander realized that what had been restored was more than his daughter's health. It was the reminder that dignity does not respond to force, that healing often arrives through those willing to listen, and that respect is not given by position but earned through humility. And that day, without speeches or declarations, the world inside that house remembered what dignity looks like.